You're listening to the Ag Policy Connection, brought to you by Real Agriculture in partnership with the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute. We're connecting the dots between the people and the policies that shape agriculture and farming today and into the future.
It was in 2004 when highly pathogenic avian influenza first hit Canada, devastating poultry production in southern British Columbia. At the time, it had been less than a year since BSE was found in a cow in Alberta, rocking the Canadian cattle industry. And without any playbook on how to manage this new avian influenza virus, a decision was made to cull all the birds on commercial farms in BC's Fraser Valley, one of, if not the most intensive poultry producing regions in Canada. In the end, after the 2004 outbreak was all said and done, 53 sites tested positive for the H7N3 virus. A total of 16.2 million birds were ordered destroyed on farms, and the economic cost was estimated at over $393 million. If you compare that with the current outbreak this past winter, almost double that number of farms have tested positive in British Columbia alone, 103 premises this past winter. And BC's not alone this time around, as there have been positive cases from coast to coast. But there's been no mass cull as the playbook for managing avian influenza has evolved. I'm Kelvin Hepner, and as part of this episode of the Ag Policy Connection, we're going to focus on the policies around animal health disease outbreaks and how we respond to them in Canada, exploring the lessons that were learned from that first outbreak of avian influenza in 2004, how those lessons apply today, both in terms of the unprecedented avian influenza situation that's still unfolding, and in broader animal health disease context, in what we might call hope for the best but prepare for the worst scenarios, such as African swine fever or foot and mouth disease. What lessons were learned back in 2004? What happens if the current virus becomes endemic? What's the role for industry and provinces when the Canadian Food Inspection Agency's capacity is stretched? What are some of the lessons that apply to other animal disease scenarios, again, such as African swine fever or foot and mouth disease? These are some of the questions and issues that we're going to discuss as we bring our panelists in for this episode, and I'm going to let them introduce themselves, but just a quick intro. We have Rory McAlpine, longtime Senior Vice President of Maple Leaf Foods, and Rory was actually the Deputy Minister of Agriculture for the BC government during the 2004 outbreak. We also have Harvey Sasaki, who recently finished his term as Chair of the BC Chicken Marketing Board, and Steve Leech, the Director of Food Safety and Animal Health for Chicken Farmers of Canada. And I should also add a personal note, as I'm hosting this episode with wearing a couple hats, as my family, we also have a broiler hatching egg chicken operation here in southern Manitoba. So just for disclosure's sake, some of my questions, and if we get into the weeds, I apologize, might be coming from that perspective. Without further ado, our discussion on avian influenza and how we handle animal health disease outbreaks in Canada. All right, welcome to the Ag Policy Connection. Rory, Harvey, and Steve, thanks for taking the time to join us today.
Thanks for having us. Happy to be here.
Before we begin, I'd like to give our audience a bit of a taste of where our guests, our panelists are coming from, the perspective that each of you are bringing. So, Harvey, when it comes to the issue of high path avian influenza, what's your experience, or what's the background that you bring to this issue?
Well, I was an ADM, Assistant Deputy Minister in the BC Ministry of Agriculture in 2004 when we had the first outbreak. We also went through it again in 2005, 2009. I retired from the provincial government in 2010, but was invited by the industry to look at the lessons learned from an industry perspective in the 2014 event. And then I was the chair of the BC Chicken Marketing Board when we've had the most current event. And my tenure as chair of the Chicken Board had just ended in December of 2022. So I've experienced all of the outbreaks in British Columbia.
And you would have worked alongside Rory then, right, Rory?
Yes, I was deputy minister in British Columbia back in 2003, 4, 5 when that first outbreak occurred that Harvey references. And I subsequently worked for 15 years with Maple Leaf Foods and was involved in various aspects of the poultry side of the business and animal health risk management generally in livestock and poultry in Canada since then. So I've got some perspective in the subsequent years about how we perhaps better mitigate these risks and manage the challenges of foreign animal disease outbreaks across the country.
Steve, what's your connection in your role at Chicken Farmers of Canada?
Yeah, I'm the Director of Food Safety and Animal Health here at Chicken Farmers of Canada, and really part of the role is to be a liaison between CFIA and our provincial boards. I was also at Chicken Farmers of Canada for our first AI event in Canada in 2004 in BC, and subsequently through the events that we had in Saskatchewan, Ontario, a few in BC, and now with 2022. So actively involved in working on policy with CFIA and with our provincial boards in terms of implementing emergency operations centers and becoming integrated in the emergency disease response systems.
All right. Well, I think we can go back to 2004 then and maybe go over kind of the context, some of the things that happened, the events that happened in the early 2000s. And I'd like to get to some of the lessons learned and how that applies today when it comes to the ongoing outbreak that we're dealing with, not only in Canada, but the rest of North America and around the world. Harvey, why don't we start with you going back to 2004? What do you recall in terms of first maybe finding out about the presence of high-path avian influenza in those early days?
Well, it was quite a shocking experience to have to actually go through it. We didn't really know what to expect. And just to set some context as to what came out of it, and then I'll let Rory speak to some of the things in terms of the challenges that the province had in terms of working with CFIA, and some of those became lessons learned. But I'll provide a bit of context around the 2004 event. It broke in February of 2004 in a hatching egg operation, and it spread to a neighboring farm. And CFIA had come in and was starting to assess the situation. Before we got to the full depopulation of those two farms, it had broke the containment zone and was showing up in other areas. By the end of the outbreak in 2004, there were 53 infected premises that were confirmed through testing. We wound up with an order being made to depopulate the entire Fraser Valley, which was made up a total of 16.2 million birds were ordered destroyed. Some of those where they had tested the flocks before shipment in terms of the broilers, they could go to the processing facilities, but the long cycle birds, the layers, the hatching egg birds, they all were euthanized. In terms of the impact to British Columbia, we had retained Saracon consultants to do an assessment of the economic impacts, and they came out up with $393.2 million in total economic impact. The direct impacts to the poultry industry were $222 million. And so it was, a very significant hit to the industry. Needless to say, the recovery period in terms of the long cycle birds, the layers and the hatching egg production, because it's supply managed, it had to be scheduled back into production. So it took up to 2 years for some of those producers to actually be back into production. To give you a context around, okay, so it's 53 premises in 2004. Currently in 2022, 23, we have 100 3 infected premises. That's both commercial and non-commercial premises, and that there were 3.65 million birds that have been euthanized this time around. So we've had just about double the number of premises that were infected, but a significantly lower number of birds ordered destroyed. And there's some good lessons learned that came out of 2004 and the subsequent events that have evolved the thinking in terms of some of that management. But the province played a pretty significant role, and credits due to Rory and his leadership in terms of working CFIA, and I'll let him maybe speak to that.
Yeah, Rory, why don't you take it from there and unpack some of those decisions that were made back in 2004, including that order to depopulate the remaining birds in the Fraser Valley. That must have been quite the decision, whoever made that.
Yeah, well, yeah, it was very challenging, but I think what's important to understand, it starts with, as Harvey says, the CFIA's mandate over foreign animal disease risk management in Canada as a result of the Health of Animals Act federally. So, we're talking about livestock diseases that are not endemic to Canada and which, in this case, cause significant mortality in infected premises and, is at risk of spreading. It starts, of course, the big problem with high path AI is it's the reservoirs in wild birds. And British Columbia is, of course, on a migratory bird pathway. And, this is the ongoing challenge of the wild bird population spreading the disease into domestic poultry. But while the Health of Animals Act puts all this responsibility on the CFIA, the challenge in emergency response, and we've seen this play out in many disease events in different species in Canada, is that the operational response is generally well beyond the capacity of the CFIA. And the economic impacts, of course, are felt throughout the regional or provincial economy. And the industry directly is, where the resources lie to effectively depopulate and actually then restore the industry. So the response has to be based on a collaboration. And that's been the challenging part to learn. Everybody's operating within their legal mandates or their existing structure, but in the case of an emergency or a crisis, business as usual goes out the window. And it's been challenging for the CFIA, I would say, to learn that lesson. And there is a foundational kind of process of intergovernmental cooperation on all of this. And at the time in 2004, there was a bilateral foreign animal disease eradication plan that had been signed off. But the biggest problem, I would say, was the absence of industry. And it took a long time for the federal government, to realize that it desperately needed industry resourcing and collaboration and industry participation in the Emergency Management Center. And I don't know how well that has played out in the more recent events, but it was many weeks before the federal government really turned to the industry in BC to help manage the situation. Maybe Steve or Harvey wants to talk about how that sort of interjurisdictional collaboration and the participation of industry has played out in the more recent situation.
Yeah, Steve, why don't you jump in and go through what you remember from 2004 and how that applies, especially on this interjurisdictional issue that I think is still relevant in the current situation.
Yeah, Kelvin, 2004 was incredibly challenging time for everyone involved. I think all stakeholders, industry, provincial and federal governments. And I think the reason for that is it was brand new. We did have the Health of Animals Act. We had the Health of Animals regulations. And then beyond that, there was really nothing. We did not have protocols and policies like we do today that direct how we manage an emergency, an animal disease emergency. And it took a lot of experiences to work through some of those problems. So, I think one of the largest things that came out of 2004, lessons learned, is the development of, an AI hazard specific plan, development of protocols and policies about surveillance and movement. So that we know exactly how to control the disease, but also how to try and maintain business as usual during a crisis situation. And I think that because we didn't have those policies, we hadn't really sat down as industry and governments and decided how we were going to work through this. Definitely, we knew the federal government has, authoritative jurisdiction over foreign animal disease, but that collaboration is just so important between government and industry in terms of getting things done, and moving forward and trying to get back to business as usual as quickly as possible. So, if we learned one thing in 2004, it was the need for collaboration. And that was the only way we were going to get things done and get things moved through the situation that was in front of us.
Harvey, if we go back to that order in 2004, that depopulation order for the remaining birds in the Fraser Valley, that's one difference, obviously, where that same order hasn't been issued or wasn't issued in 2022, despite the number of cases being significantly higher, as you alluded to. What was the thinking behind that order, and is that something that has been second guessed since then, or that obviously there's been a change in thinking as that hasn't been what's the difference between then and now, I guess?
I think, one of the main things that comes to my mind in terms of what happened was, you'll recall that prior to the avian influenza outbreak, we were dealing with BSE in cattle. And so, and BSE is a very different beast than avian influenza in terms of that it's slow spreading. It's one that you still have to destroy the animals, but your consideration of spread, in the ways that we see now in terms of how quickly avian influenza can spread is not the same. And so the team that came to lead the response for CFIA had come off of controlling BSE and thought that the same approach in terms of, depopulation and management would work. Well, it didn't. And so as, and one of the critical things that happened and again is something that, we need to remember, is when we had it confined to the first two premises, the industry itself convened a meeting. I had the privilege of being in the meeting room where the boards and the industry associations were actually plotting out a strategy to basically do a preemptive cull of all of the birds within 1 kilometers of those premises, infected premises. And they had put that forward to CFIA. The decision making on that took 5 days. And by that time, the disease had broken through the containment zone and was starting to spread. And what had happened was you started to see it popping up here, there, and everywhere. So that it was, I think that in 2022, we've had the same amount of dispersal of farms that have been infected in the Fraser Valley, but the containment measures in terms of how we chose to depopulate and then do the disposal of the dead birds has changed. At the time, so having had no experience, the first thought was, okay, well, we have to dispose of the animals that get euthanized, and so incineration is something that we should do. Well, so we found an abandoned mine pit where we had an incinerator that we could use, but that meant trucking infected dead birds out of the Fraser Valley to Princeton, which then contributed to some of the spread. And so we now do in-barn composting so as to contain the virus within the barn environment as opposed to exposing it out to the broader environment and the risk of spread. So this rapid spreading and the inability to keep up, I think, is what ultimately led to the ordered destruction. One of the other things that the province, as Rory had said, was sitting back, playing a supportive role to CFIA, but there came a point where the premier of the province actually said, enough is enough. This is not being managed. And he ordered our emergency management BC group who manage wildfires and work with the incident command system constantly, that they came in and started to participate. It was at that point in time where they were observing. They weren't directing, they were observing. And I think it was through them going back into the province, it said, look, this thing's out of control. We're never going to be able to contain this. So I think it ultimately then led to the decision by CFIA to order the destruction and depopulation of the entire Fraser Valley. And so, as I was saying, that we were fearful that was going to repeat itself this past year in 2022, with the number and the speed at which the number of infected premises were manifesting. But fortunately, we were able to not have to resort to that level of ordered destruction.
Rory, what do you recall from those events that Harvey's recalling?
Yeah, it was challenging, and in these situations, you don't really want a kind of political direction beginning to come on board. I mean, it's very much about the experts that need to understand the disease and the risks, but there was no playbook, right? And so that's what's, I think, clearly different today. And of course, the one thing I always reflect on in what's occurred and why actually the poultry industry is in relatively much better shape, it is the supply management system. Like you had an existing industry organization structure, like we knew where every single poultry premise in the province was. We had, a responsible board with financial resources. Like, all of that's in place, just given the supply managed system. It's very different when you deal with, cattle and hogs and so on, where it's even knowing where all the premises are in a disease outbreak can be very challenging. So, there was a lot of upside to that. But I guess what, continues to concern me to this day is that we keep kind of inventing the playbook in terms of how to respond. And I've seen this in my more recent phase of my career in the pork industry, where the big risk is African swine fever, like a devastating foreign animal disease that would overnight, if it occurred in Canada, bring to a halt $3 billion in Canadian pork exports. And there's a whole lot of work going on to that, but it does speak to the need for a different understanding of governance and how we have to build preemptively the models for risk management, but importantly, risk prevention, so that we don't hopefully incur these kind of major events in our livestock and poultry industries. And, I put a lot of work into that. So that's, I think, the big thing, and the importance of learning these lessons. Like, we had a very significant lessons learned exercise in 2004 or 2005, I guess, once it was all done. And I think that paid dividends down the road, because when other provinces, I think if I recall, the next major outbreaks occurred in Ontario, they were able to draw on the lessons learned in Ontario and avoid the kind of massive culling that we unfortunately had to experience back then.
Yeah. Excellent point, Rory, about the broader relevance of some of these lessons learned, not just in poultry, but also in other livestock sectors and other foreign animal disease outbreak scenarios. Steve, Rory mentioned the playbook and how there wasn't a playbook in 2004. Where are we at today in 2022 or 2023 in terms of the ongoing outbreak scenario? How much of that playbook is filled in, and is capacity an issue here as well in terms of historical knowledge and maintaining that continuity at CFIA and in some of those key roles? Is that an issue that we've dealt with in the current outbreak?
I think the good news coming out of 2004 BC is that we developed a playbook. We got to know the virus, we understood the virus, and we put in place policies and protocols to protect us going down the road, and we're still benefiting from that. Rory spoke about that lessons learned meeting. I remember that well. And Just to highlight a few, we now have an avian influenza laboratory network across Canada in different provinces. Whereas in 2004, we had to send every sample to Winnipeg, to the CFIA lab in Winnipeg, to get tested for AI. So you can understand the time commitment, the resources. I believe we chartered a commercial jet every day just to get those samples there. Now we have AI labs in each of the provinces, which can help increase that capacity, but also speed up our response. So right off the bat, we're much more prepared. And you get results back within a matter of hours and days versus week and et cetera that it was in the past. International reaction. In 2004, it was a shutdown of the Canadian market. Rory mentioned it on the hog side, but now we've got countries which are much more responsive, much more understanding. So when other countries put in place trade restrictions, it's more either on the primary control zone or maybe even at the province level, but having a much less of an impact on the Canadian industry as a whole. Just having emergency response teams in every single province. I think that was the big, 2004 was a wake-up call to the rest of the industry, really, about how devastating avian influenza or any animal disease could be. And it really pushed and made a priority for us to develop, both at the national level, an emergency response team, but also within each of the provinces, and to develop those relationships with the provincial government and the federal government. So that if an animal disease hit, then the actions could be quickly put into place. And Kelvin, I think that's what we've seen in the subsequent outbreaks after 2004, but also in 2002, where we've had outbreaks across the country, in each of the provinces. And this has presented a different realm, whereas in the past, it was always within one province and focused attention from the federal government, as well as the EOC within that province. Now we're looking at, just as you said, expanding those resources, those limited resources, both at the government and the industry level, to responding to the disease in multiple provinces. So all the lessons that we've learned, now we've got different dynamics. We've got, wild birds that have high path avian influenza. It's not low path. We're in multiple provinces all at once, and these emergency operations teams that we've set up, which really were built to last for a couple months, have now been ongoing a year or more than a year. So there's different elements. As Rory said, we have to continually update our playbook to make sure that we're responding as well as we can.
Yeah. And even from a surge capacity perspective, along the lines of what you were saying, Steve, until now, it's traditionally been a scenario where it's involved one province and national resources can focus in one province. Now they're being spread across almost all the provinces. I guess that puts more of an onus on that interjurisdictional effort that we alluded to earlier, in terms of industry, the provincial governments, and Canadian Food Inspection Agency, the federal government working together.
Exactly. In past outbreaks, we've been used to having the federal government come in and really control the situation on the infected premises, from destruction to disposal, et cetera. Now that resources are so thin, we have to look at different ways in order to make sure that we're controlling as best as possible and getting back to business as quickly as possible. So that's really pushed both government and industries to decide how provincial governments can become more involved, as well as how industry can become more involved and participate in some of those activities, so that we can make sure that we're controlling the disease as well as we can.
Rory, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I can maybe just build a bit on that in terms of things that have occurred more broadly. So in the light of what we've learned through BSE, through avian influenza, and various other issues, about 5 years ago now, with the leadership of industry, including my company at the time, Maple Leaf, we brought together all the livestock and poultry industry stakeholders and formed a vision of what we now call Animal Health Canada. And Animal Health Canada, the idea is to bring around one table all the relevant livestock and meat processing and dairy groups in Canada with provincial and federal government partners. On the federal side, importantly, of course, CFIA and Agri-Food Canada. But the idea is to do a much better job of strategically prioritizing all the investments, first and foremost, in disease prevention. So, standards of biosecurity that, like we just discussed, diagnostic test capability and surge capacity, traceability is so critical, and emergency preparedness and planning. Vaccine research. Just in good news, in the last budget here, just a week ago, the federal government is now going to fund a national foot and mouth disease vaccine bank for Canada, so that in the event of an FMD outbreak in cattle, we've got our own reliable source of vaccine. So these sorts of investments, I think, have lacked. We've been responding to events. The idea is we've got to get ahead of them and invest much more in the preventative side of this. And, my dream would be we get right to the idea of a public-private partnership. Like I say, it's in good shape, I think, generally in poultry because of the supply management system. But critically in other animal diseases, it's about compensation. Like the decision of whether a producer collaborates in an emergency response depends very critically on whether he knows he's going to get compensated for the destruction of his animals. Literally in the case of African swine fever, the big fear is that a farmer who's now got worthless animals on his property because they cannot be processed for export is inclined potentially to literally open the barn door. And, this sort of animal welfare catastrophe is just waiting. So we have to have a system of knowing preemptively what is the model of compensation, not just for the value of the animals destroyed, but the whole industry that's affected. And like Harvey mentioned, waiting 5 days for government decisions or 10 or 2 or weeks or whatever is just way too long. And so my idea would be we'd have a partnership and a predetermined model. And in fact, there are examples of this in Australia, for example, and other countries that we can learn from.
Excellent insight there, Rory. On the compensation front, regarding the AI outbreak in 2004, Harvey, how did that work for the producers that were affected?
Well, it was a challenge. We quickly found that the compensation schedules that were prescribed in the Health of Animals Act regulation were not reflective of a fair market value for the birds, particularly some of the breeding stock that was there in particular. So that in and of itself was a challenge, but people at the CFIA could only pay what they had in their schedules, but they were creative in terms of compensating for, feed that, was on the farm, other, materials that had to be destroyed. So, a bitter pill, but it resulted in the current compensation rates that CFIA has today. And to date, through all of the events that we've had in British Columbia, I haven't heard of any concerns about the amount of compensation for those birds ordered destroyed. What we did run into, though, in 2004, cleaning and disinfection had to be completed, and the 21-day period after sign-off of the cleaning and disinfection of the last infected premise is what was required in order to start the repopulation into barns. And so, and the cleaning and disinfection was not a cost that would be covered by CFIA. So that was an industry or the infected premise owner's responsibility. In 2004, this is where the boards and the processing sector in British Columbia came together and contributed the $3 million, put the $3 million up to deal with the 49 commercial premises to get them cleaned and disinfected in the shortest time possible and get those signed off so that they could get back to repopulation and back into the supply system. So that being identified as an issue, the industry in British Columbia began to look at, how do we, alleviate this problem of having somebody who is an infected premise owner saying that, well, I don't have any money, I don't have any cash flow coming in now because my birds have been ordered destroyed. How do I, go to this cost of cleaning and disinfecting? And so in subsequent years, and it wasn't really until 2014 when we had another high path event where we had 11 commercial premises that had it. And we had one layer operation that had their pullets, as well as their layers, as well as a full, trailer load of eggs that were ready to be shipped had to be destroyed on farm. That created a huge mess. That cost of the cleaning and disinfection of that one farm was the equivalent of about $4 a bird, $4 to $5 a bird. And so, fortunately, we were able to get to Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. The province was able to get Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada to agree to agri-recovery to cover, some of the costs of cleaning and disinfecting those infected premises. It was on the basis of that commitment that we could convince all of the farmers to get on with the job and do it. So we were able to, address that. But following the 2014 event, the federal government and the province said, you've had it 3 times in terms of coming to agri-recovery. You're no longer eligible for agri-recovery, so you have to do something on your own. So we did have the boards and commission in British Columbia, the Hatching Aid Commission, agree to fund the cleaning and disinfection of infected premises in any subsequent event. The egg industry in British Columbia was part of the Canadian Egg Industry Reciprocal group, Sierra, and they provided, in addition to the SE salmonella insurance that they had, an avian influenza insurance, which covered their cleaning and disinfection costs. So we've managed to cover off that deficiency, but it took a long time to get there, to get to that point. But again, depending on the farm, depending on the circumstances, it can be as low as 50 cents a bird and cost you upwards to $4 to $5 a bird, in terms of those cleaning and disinfection costs to get it to the point where you get the CFIA sign off. And it was critical up until 2014 that you had to have the cleaning and disinfection of the infected premise signed off by CFIA before you could commence repopulation. But I'll let Steve talk to what the policy change has been in 2022, because they've relaxed that a bit, and that was what also enabled us in BC to survive with the 100 plus infected premises in the current round of avian influenza.
Steve, you want to continue with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the financial impact is there is a hit there for sure. There is the compensation for the birds that are already destroyed, but there's downtime, there's business interruption costs, there's other C&D costs, and so I think this is still quite a heavy concern for producers. And as Harvey said, one of the things that we've learned over the course of the last year is to be a little bit flexible in terms of how we're managing this virus, because this virus that we're dealing with in the last year is different than what we've seen in 2004. So it's not so much that it's coming into a barn and then spreading from there, but we literally have high path AI dropping, from the sky. From wild birds, and as a result, there's been a number of changes from what we learned in the spring, the cases through the spring of 2022. By the time the fall came around, we did have some different policies in place through CFIA, specifically for placement of birds, as Harvey said. Originally, there was no placements allowed within 0 to 3 kilometers of an infected premise, but with surveillance, you could place within the 1 to 3 kilometer zone. And then as soon as those compost piles, in-barn compost piles were capped, you'd be able to place within the 1 kilometer zone as well. So that, it's these types of changes that have helped control the disease, but have also helped us get back to business in a quicker fashion than we have in the past. I'd say there's been a number of other changes as well, just in terms of how primary control zones have been operated, whereas in the past, We had to wait until, the final sign off of cleaning and disinfecting, as Harvey said, and then wait another 28 days after that. But now we have a better understanding of the virus and how it moves. So now we have what we call a primary decontamination step, which is really the first phase of C&D. And once that process is done, then the rest of the farms within the primary control zone, it goes to a security zone, takes a step back really from the overall surveillance and movement controls that are in place, which allows, again, a little bit business as usual in order to keep the industry moving along. I think one of the other big changes that we saw, it started out as a negative, is that there's actually a definition change at the World Organization for Animal Health, the old OIE, that basically changed how government had to react when there was a positive AI on a small non-commercial farm. And what the result is that it had to be really treated the same as a commercial farm. So we had the same primary control zone, same surveillance, same movement protocols. And this was in 2022, where we had quite a number of backyard flocks and non-commercials testing positive. This had quite a negative impact on the commercial industry. And we were able as industry to bring this forward, to work with CFIA. And in the fall, CFIA had come up with a revised, more flexible strategy that there would continue to be a primary control zone around these operations, but surveillance and movement controls would be entirely different. And that really helped from a domestic perspective. It still has an international repercussion in terms of exports, but from a domestic perspective, the industry was able to keep moving. So I think it's these continued lessons learned that we have to keep working on together in collaboration, especially when we're learning about a new virus and how this virus operates. Because again, this isn't just a couple months where we can get through a troublesome time. Now we're more than a year in, and we know we're going to keep having to deal with this virus for some time to come. So we need to look at all the systems and determine how we can become more efficient with what we have.
Well, Steve, I think I'll go ahead, Harvey.
Sorry, Calvin, if I can just add to one thing that Steve had said, and why it's important in terms of some of these policy changes. So, BC was the first to have avian influenza, and I think one of the learning moments for CFIA, where they were trying to manage the issue from Ottawa, was a lack of understanding and perspective of the dynamic of the industry in British Columbia and the concentration of the poultry industry in the Fraser Valley. And so that is, unique in terms of the national perspective. And so you have to, and so in 2022, when we started to have the outbreaks, when it started on the East Coast, it started in Newfoundland, it moved west, and British Columbia was last. Some of the policies that were set were working well in other provinces where you didn't have that concentration of farms. But when it hit in BC, that, as Steve said, the small backyard flock that gets tested positive, and you throw up a 10-kilometer primary control zone around it, you capture a lot of commercial premises in British Columbia, whereas, in Alberta, 10 kilometers away, you may be lucky to get one, or in Saskatchewan, even, less so. And so, to put it in its perspective, that even with a 3-kilometer infected zone, that is one of the ones that CFIA uses, in the Fraser Valley in British Columbia, you could have 30 to 50 commercial farms fall within that 3-kilometer circle. And so that's the dynamic that is unique in British Columbia in terms of the impact of these policies, particularly the small lot backyard one, but even with the commercial sector, and you have one, you've got 30 to 50 farms within 3 kilometers there, and they're all held up in terms of their repopulation under the old rules until that first one was cleaned and disinfected and the 21-day wait period was over. But now with their new provisions, you can actually get back in and start repopulating as soon as the virus is deemed destroyed in the composting process in barns. So that is something that's really significant. So the lessons learned in BC and the applications that come out of BC, they could be applied anywhere else in Canada and work effectively. But if you try to design policies based in some of the rural areas or prairies where you don't have the same level of concentration, you're just going to run into huge problems in British Columbia and even in 2004 we invited the minister and the head of CFIA, president of CFIA, to come out, and actually the industry had a helicopter and toured the minister and the president of CFIA around over the Fraser Valley to get the proper perspective in terms of that concentration. And once they saw that, they understood. And I think, again, that was also a contributing factor to, once it got out of control, to the full order destruction of the entire Fraser Valley. We were running into the same lack of understanding this past year in 2022, and the industry was getting frustrated. We managed to, through the province, get a meeting with the president of CFIA and the key staff, and actually got Dr. Ireland she came out to British Columbia following that meeting. We toured her around to see the physical lay of the land and the proximity of the operations. And she had a much better understanding and appreciation of what we were up against in BC and why the industry was being very pushy in terms of some of the things that we saw were being restrictive in terms of our ability to maintain the system of orderly marketing.
Steve, I want to go back to you. What happens if this current outbreak becomes endemic? This virus becomes endemic. Is a vaccine where we end up on this?
Well, I think that's part of what we're talking about as industry and with government right now is our advanced planning and kind of long-term outlook. Not only when only dealing with, I say only, but when dealing with one virus, with dealing with AI, but what happens if we do have African swine fever or foot and mouth, and where are the resources, where's the resource demand at that point? So to that end, I'd say that we are working a lot more on a collaborative model in terms of our animal disease response, having industry become a lot more involved in the destruction, in the disposal aspects and biocontainment, so that we can be prepared to basically stand up for our industry and protect our industry should that need arise. And on a global scale, there is a lot of attention right now on an avian influenza vaccine. I think that's, AI is hitting internationally, and one of the resulting elements of that is that the international community is engaged. They want to talk about an AI vaccine now, where in the past it was always a trade issue. So there are a few countries throughout the world that vaccinate, but they don't have a trade profile. And now we've got large players across the world that are coming together to really understand how we can develop a system where we can use AI vaccination and still allow trade. There's a number of barriers to that. Main one being is that we need some good AI vaccine candidates. So there are a lot of trials going on right now in the Netherlands, in France, US. There's a number that are conducting trials in labs or on ducks, for example. So I think we'll see in the next, call it 6+ months, some the results coming from those to determine if some of the vaccine candidates that we're looking at will be effective against this virus. And then we still need to get past the trade issue, but hopefully with the amount of pressure that we see, we will be able to move beyond that. I think it's worthwhile to note that the Canadian industry is certainly wants this tool in our toolbox. We've asked the Canadian government to be actively involved with our trading partners to come up with the rules and operational guidance around that. However, vaccines are just one tool in our toolbox. This is not going to be the 100% solution. It may diminish. It may diminish the level of mortality in a flock, et cetera, but a flock with AI will still need to be destroyed. So again, we want to see the ability to use vaccines, but we need to keep relying on biosecurity and biocontainment in order to make sure that, that we're properly managing this disease going forward.
And I guess you'd have to have some sort of methodology to be able to differentiate whether a flock is testing positive from a vaccine source versus a wild bird source or an actual disease source.
Exactly, and that's really been the problem internationally from a trade perspective is how do you go about doing that? And the good news is that over the last number of years, we have the technology and tools to be able to develop that. So there's quite a number of pharmaceutical companies that are working on that aspect right now and developing an AI vaccine that could fulfill that role. But there's also a concern about the fact that when you use a vaccine, it could cover an underlying AI infection or AI spread. So with any use of a vaccine, there would need to be an ongoing surveillance program, either within the region or the province or the country. And what that looks like is still being developed, because it needs to be developed with industry and with the Canadian government, but at the same time, it has to satisfy our international trading partners. So everybody's working on this at the same time, not knowing exactly what the final outcome will be. And that's going to take a little bit of time to develop to make sure that what we come up with is going to be acceptable to our trading partners and vice versa. But again, we do have the attention of the international community, and I think that that we will see this developed in the near term.
Okay, Rory, you have experience on some of these trade issues when it comes to animal health issues. What do you see as the path forward here when it comes to AI and the future of dealing with this if this becomes an endemic virus?
I think Steve's hit the right point here. It requires an international alignment, and that means the codes under the World Organization for Animal Health have to be aligned from the perspective of veterinary risk and disease risk management, but also trade, because we're living in a world that's just increasingly hungry for more protein. Meat, poultry, and so on. And when you get so many countries infected with the disease that then compromises global food supply, you've got a problem, and there needs to be some new compromise. And to the extent that, you can vaccinate, but include a marker in that vaccine that tells you then, based on a blood sample, whether the bird is vaccinated or has in fact been exposed to the virus, that's a really critical aspect of it. We're very concerned about that in the pork side, because so far there still isn't a reliable vaccine for ASF, but it's in development. But again, imagine a scenario where North America gets African swine fever and is responsible for billions of dollars of meat exports to Asia and the world now being shut off. Like, that's just not acceptable because of the human suffering and the economic impact that would flow from that. So, these are challenges that have to be addressed. But again, back to the whole point about biosecurity, like, that's where we really have to invest and just be ready and looking at the disease risk profile going forward. As we learned so much in COVID, right, about what it takes to ramp up emergency response and to, in that case, actually very rapidly develop vaccines. We need to do that. I believe I'm involved with the Vaccine Infectious Disease Organization at the University of Saskatchewan. The idea is to build vaccine platforms where you essentially have, if you will, like an AI technology platform. And with these new vaccine technologies, you then can tweak it pretty quickly to be appropriate for the intended target and respond much faster. So investing in those sort of technology platforms, both for the sake of human health protection and animal health protection, I think is where we have to go globally.
All right. Harvey, I'll give you the chance to also speak to where you see the industry going in terms of poultry production here. And Rory's made some excellent points there that overlap with other industries or broader health issues in both livestock and in people. What do you see as kind of the light at the end of the tunnel when it comes to the current situation, Harvey?
Well, again, I think Steve and Rory have touched on the main things. I think one of the things that we had done in 2004, as Steve and Rory had mentioned, we had that lessons learned conference, which involved all players in the industry, not just within BC, but from across the country. The national organizations were involved. The full value chain was involved, as well as federal, provincial, and local government. And because it does take all of the the parties in terms of putting together that response. But then, as well, coming out of that conference, the industry in British Columbia undertook to do a risk assessment process and looked at identifying and assessing risk factors, that predispose the industry to disease outbreaks, and provide opportunities and risk management options for industry to consider and how to minimize outbreaks. Coming out of that, they came up with a 4-point strategy. One was that we needed to establish our own emergency response system, which everybody has now. They set that up. But as Rory said, we have to get the CFIA to recognize the industry role in that more, and actually be actively participating at that table, not just being directed by CFIA. Well, you can do this, you can do that. It's being a partner in the response, not just a component of the response. A second element was the biosecurity standards. We in British Columbia were the first to adopt mandatory biosecurity. I think it's adopted nationally in all the feather sectors now. But I think there are always room for improvement in terms of those standards. And so we do need to critically assess and use the epidemiological reports that have come out and studies that have come out on each of the outbreaks in each of the provinces to see, okay, where can we further tighten up our biosecurity or improve on our biosecurity measures? However, following the 2014 event, we had a lessons learned session, and we had some experts come in and talk about biosecurity. And one of the disconcerting messages was that, no level of biosecurity is going to fully 100% prevent the incursion of AI virus into a barn. And so we have to be cognizant of that, but doesn't mean that we don't do anything to improve our biosecurity. We do need to build on improving our biosecurity. Steve mentioned it about more active surveillance. That's been a touchy subject and does remain a touchy subject with the industry in terms of actively looking for it, so that, and finding it. But if we find it, what can we do about it? And so we've also had some work done by our provincial animal health specialists in terms of looking at environmental indicators of it, not just dead bird surveillance, but looking into ponds and water areas that waterfowl frequent, and seeing if they can detect the virus in those. How we use that, I'm not sure, but these are all part of the active surveillance mechanisms that we have to start to put into play. And then finally, the last point of the 4-point strategy that the industry came out with in 2009 in BC was looking at the financial implications. And I think, the financial implications and stressors are only going to get more as CFIA looks to industry to, being more of an active participant in the response mechanisms. And so that goes without saying that involves dollars and how do we fund that? How does that get turned into finances and into action? So I think that those are things that, notwithstanding what's also going on at the global scale, domestically within provinces and nationally, those still remain, I think, the 4 critical elements that we need to take a step back and reassess and reestablish that plan going forward.
On the financial implications, Harvey, are you concerned that the government of Canada, CFIA budget may be stretched thin with the current outbreak in terms of the compensation for this, or there might be fiscal constraints from a political perspective?
That's, I think, the biggest concern, because the Health of Animals Act itself says the minister may compensate for animals ordered destroyed. It doesn't say that they must or they shall. So that seems to be that, if we get to a point where it becomes endemic, does that mean that CFIA can wash their hands of compensating for destroyed animals? And what does that mean? I mean, those are the kinds of questions that need to be asked, and options need to be explored and discussed, around a broad group of industry and government talking about these things in terms of how do we plan that going forward.
All right, we're just about out of time here, but Rory, maybe I'll go to you for the final word, and that's because I think I've grasped a theme in your comments throughout, and that is that whether we're talking biosecurity, surveillance, the financial implications and signals at the producer level, talking with trading partners, there are lessons from the avian influenza outbreak, both in 2004 and the ongoing outbreak, that not only improve that playbook going forward, but also apply to other broader animal health disease outbreaks, whether we're talking pigs or cattle, maybe even people going forward.
Well, I think what you can hear in all the conversation of this, that what really matters is certainty, right? Predictability of response mechanisms, of compensation, and assuredness, or, year after year investment in prevention, biosecurity, and so on. So that then speaks to the challenge of trying to reconcile the goal of certainty against a situation that entails the collaboration of all levels of government. And bear in mind, too, as much as we talk about the economic impact of these events, very often the economic impact beyond the immediately impacted livestock industry is greater. Like, there's great reports, for example, out of the UK when they had their foot and mouth outbreak in 2001, where the impact to the broader economy was twice the impact to the affected livestock industries themselves. So this has major consequences. And so predictability is so important in setting up the resource structure and the decision-making framework. And in my view, that then speaks to the governance. You can't just depend on the normal kind of business as usual political response mechanisms, or, like Harvey says, legislation that says the government may compensate, they may not. They may, have funds for surveillance this year, but not necessarily next year. Like we've learned in the case of COVID, how the investment in your planning and prevention is so critical, and in the end can save you a lot of dollars down the road when things go off the rails, because you've planned and you don't have to incur the same costs. So that's where I, as I said earlier, really support the concept of a public-private partnership and some greater predictability and longevity to the institutionalization of animal health risk management for Canada.
Yeah. This has been an excellent conversation, gentlemen. Thank you, Harvey, Steve, and Rory, for taking the time to discuss and reflect on some of the lessons that can be applied when it comes to dealing not only with avian influenza but animal health outbreaks in general as part of this Ag Policy Connection podcast. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yep.
Great.
Well, this episode of the Ag Policy Connection was a bit different maybe from some of our other ones, in that we're talking about an issue here that is still very front and center this spring, with migratory bird season underway and the industry still definitely not out of the woods, as we talked about with Harvey and Steve and Rory when it comes to the current avian influenza situation, but certainly some good points in there as well about the lessons that have been learned, and not only how they apply to the avian influenza situation and how the poultry sector responds, how government responds, but also lessons that apply to other animal health disease scenarios, as Rory talked about. Thanks again to Rory McAlpine. And I should mention Rory's also a director for the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute. Thanks to him, Harvey, Sasaki, and Steve Leech for joining us for this episode. The Ag Policy Connection, again, is brought to you by the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute and Real Agriculture. And we appreciate your feedback. My email address is khepner@realagriculture.com. Have to say we probably set a new record for feedback and comments with our last episode, the Canadian Wheat Board, dismantling of the Canadian Wheat Board single desk. So keep the comments and conversation going. That's what this is all about, as we aim to connect the dots and have some conversation about the big policy issues in Canadian agriculture right here on the Ag Policy Connection.